Welcome, everyone, to today's broadcast. I am your host, Paul Asadorian, who largely will just be sitting here looking pretty for much of this webcast. Although I am excited about it, this is the Enterprise Security Hot Seat with our fabulous sponsor, ServiceNow. I am excited to introduce Mike Lyons. And Mike, now what is your title?
I am the head of security transformation at ServiceNow.
Security transformation.
That's
I
right.
like Transformers. You get that joke, Transformers joke sometimes.
It's a new title, so the first
there
one.
you go.
Thank you.
Alrighty, we'll be interested to hear about Optimus Prime. So, John Strand is on the lines via Skype, actually, coming into the broadcast. John, welcome to the program today.
Hey, thanks for letting me join today. As we were talking about before, it is Plaid Shirt Day. It's been months since I wore a plaid shirt. So I'm
Mike didn't get the memo.
I've fallen off the wagon.
Excellent, excellent. So just a couple of logistics before we get started. So this is very much a conversational style webcast. It's not your traditional, well, we never do the PowerPoint snooze fest, right? But there won't be any slides. It'll just be live video and us talking and asking questions, primarily asking questions of Mike that we've prepared. We're also taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, John Strand, because we have a John here in studio, John Strand will be an underwear model John Strand, our own John Strand. I hate to say our John Strand, InfoSec John Strand. Anyway, John will be monitoring for questions from the audience. So please jump in with questions. This is really your opportunity, whether you're watching live or watching a recording, to understand what vendors do in the space today. And I think we all kind of struggle with that. Certainly, John Strand and I struggle with that. And so we created these type of webinars, as well as Enterprise Security Weekly, to understand, well, like, what problems do you solve and all of those things? How do you solve them? And what is it? Is it in the cloud? Is it an appliance? Is it an agent? Is it an API? Like, what is it? Like, that's important too. So, John Strand, why don't you kick us off for today?
Yeah, so once again, I want to reiterate what Paul said. If you guys have any questions while we're presenting, we have some questions to get things started. Please feel free to kick those questions out to us, because at this point, you guys kind of drive the conversation. As Paul mentioned, whenever we're working with sponsors or potential sponsors, we really don't want to work with sponsors that are basically just trying to take a canned response and regurgitate that again and again. You guys have been at enough security conferences. You've been up and you've talked to people at the booths who just can't answer a single technical question that you offer to them. We want to change that dynamic, and we want to change the relationship between people that are buying products and the actual vendors themselves. So we do have some questions, and I think, Paul, we have to start with the most obvious question. So what is the problem that ServiceNow is setting to solve?
Oh, thanks, John. So I joined ServiceNow about 7 years ago. When I joined ServiceNow, I actually joined to help build the security team. I've been in security as a security architect for most of my career. This is my first time actually ever working in a vendor space. So when I joined, we had a small security team, and we were a moderately sized company. There's about 300 people. And we were a very metrics-driven company. So we were, an ITSM, ITIL shop. And so they tried to sort of shoehorn us into that model and respond to security issues as they would arise through those models. We realized very quickly that that was not the appropriate way to go forward. And so in-house, we had this platform that we had access to, the ServiceNow's platform. It's actually a platform first, and then they put the ITIL applications ITSM applications on top of it. But we built our own security operations technologies. We built an incident response capability based on NIST practices that we were following at the time. And we built a vulnerability response application because we had we had knowledge of many vulnerabilities, but we weren't able to remediate them. And so with those two components, we were able to produce these applications for our own usage. And working with our customers, which were, we were increasing in customers very quickly, we realized that we weren't the only ones with this problem. We were working with financial services institutions and asking how they were doing these things.
And the problem really being process and communication.
Absolutely. Those are the two most unrewarding parts of your security operations day, right? Is sending someone an email telling them what you've just done,
I think that
writing it down.
The book, The Phoenix Project, talks about that in a very interesting light and kind of brings to your mind like the process and communications problems that IT shops have.
It is, and it's not a getting smaller type of problem, right? It's unfortunately just getting larger because more people want to know. Now you have these headline level vulnerabilities, these marketing backed vulnerabilities, and maybe my general counsel would come in and say, "Can you please explain to me what poodle is?" I'm like, "Well, you're not talking about a dog, okay?" But why is this person asking me this question? They have no idea. Even if I explained the nuances of the vulnerability, they would still be looking at me saying, "I don't get it." but reporting
Right.
it. How are we doing, and how can we get better?
So we've got a comment slash, it's not really a question, but it's straight up a comment from Saran. I might actually butcher the name, so I apologize for that. Basically wrote in, we use ServiceNow in our enterprise. We have layers that give visibility into hosts on the network, Cisco Umbrella, Firepower, SCCM, and ServiceNow. So how does actually ServiceNow integrate with this ecosystem with a bunch of threat intelligence feeds and other existing feeds like SCCM to actually bring them the visibility, bring potential customers the visibility that they need?
So right off the bat, I mentioned earlier on that ServiceNow is a platform itself. So the security operations module is actually a component of an overarching platform that we have. So from there, we're not doing an integration with another component of ServiceNow. So whether it's getting data feeds from another system, an external system already into ServiceNow, or you'd like to integrate with those things, you'd like to have access to the IT ins and outs, right? The IT operations side of the house. What was the last change that occurred on this particular system? All of these things are brought to the forefront for the security organization. Now, that's ideal in a scenario where you can have this on a platform and everything can be shared. But with security information, the risk is that it's private until you know otherwise, right? Every new security incident that occurs I can't tell anyone about it because I don't know the scope of it. So by default, this is an application where we actually scoped off and isolated and sort of built our own island. But I need other people to help me remediate these things. And so when I need to engage with someone like, for example, Paul, I'm going to put you on an IT desk here. Paul is going to help me remediate some sort of situation. I can actually assign some work out of this overarching incident and give Paul a task. Maybe that task is a pre-configured task as part of a workflow we already have, or maybe it's an ad hoc thing. So it allows us to aggregate all of that data and then support whatever is going on, maybe adjust priority. You mentioned threat intelligence. We could perhaps ingest some sort of feed, whether it's a feed that I have a moderate level of trust with, maybe some sort of open source feed, or maybe it's a commercialized feed, or maybe even better, it's intelligence that I've discovered on my own. I can add these things in there and then augment and change the priority of whatever this incident is.
So that's interesting, and I hadn't considered that before, that, like John was talking about Cisco's Firepower, right? You may, as ServiceNow, take in data from that system to use it and help people make decisions, but you also may assign a task to the Firepower administrator and say, hey, can you go get me that, that requires a human, and then ingest that into your, or you might do both.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
So the other thing, a very common scenario is I've got a piece of malware on an endpoint somewhere in my environment. Right? As an analyst, I've never got up from the SOC to go get that endpoint. Maybe I have, but it's been an extreme scenario.
Back in the day, I did.
You kind of had to. In these larger shops where maybe that person's in Hong Kong and you're in New York, that's not capable. However, and then finding, who is the individual who's working in Hong Kong, and are they on shift, and where are they? Are they on sick leave? That's difficult stuff. But IT has to manage that day in and day out, right? So it has to be a body on the ground to answer when the executive calls. And so not finding that individual, getting that individual to automatically have that work routed to them, and then having that acknowledgement, follow-up, etc. Those are things that, that are really critical to responding to an attack or responding to an event.
Cool. And it's kind of interesting. You were talking about a platform, and a lot of times in security especially, they look at security tools as being independent of systems administration tools. And one of the things that kind of got me as I was going through ServiceNow's offering this morning, kind of going through it, is you guys look at it as a platform, and you can kind of hang this off of like the security idea and the security components off of the existing platform that's already being used for systems administration. I know that sounds like that, it just makes sense, right? But do you ever get any pushback for that people say, no, the security stuff has got to be completely separate and distinct from systems administration? How do you deal with those types of comments? And then also, do you guys allow that type of permission segmentation between the two worlds when necessary?
So thanks for that question. To be honest, we were going to release this software actually in 2014, just sort of at the beginning of 2015. And we actually polled our customers that were going to be potential customers of the security operations side. And when we went to them, we said, look, we have this open, we have this available to you, we've made these products. What do you think about IT and security getting along happily in the same platform all day long? And literally it was like, Moses sort of parting the sea. Half the room had their hands up saying, we're going to be great. And the other half said, absolutely, you're nuts, go away. And so we went back and said, well, let's figure out scoping this application. So by default, incidents, that's stuff that's just generally sensitive until it's not, right? As I said earlier. And so with that, that's an area where by default, we turn this thing on. And so it's locked down. But at an incident by incident level, You can involve other parts of the business. Now, other organizations may say, you know what, we are one big happy family and we're going to go at this together. Well, that's an option that they can actually turn off. Vulnerabilities, conversely, vulnerabilities in most cases are things that anyone who is responsible for an asset or is a system owner needs to be able to see the vulnerabilities. If they can't see them, they can't solve them. So in those cases, that's something where a customer can choose, you know what, isolated org, this is the way we operate. We've got one guy, he pushes a button, it all gets solved. In those scenarios, go have at it, right? You can lock it down. But typically, you want the people who own these assets or configuration items, CIs, as we say in the CMDB, the people that own those things should be able to see what affects their system. And the reason being is when I have a system that's coming up for maintenance, right? I've got server A's coming up for maintenance. I may have 20 patches I may need to deploy on that particular system. Or I've just been told about Poodle or the latest and greatest vulnerability that's been marketed. So I can look at the vulnerability and say, which one of these systems that I'm responsible for can I patch now? Or how many do I have to patch? Right?
And how much do you think that segmentation that exists between systems administration and security actually contribute to the problem of patches not being applied, of vulnerabilities continuing for a long period of time, because basically IT and security have been playing in different rooms?
I think that's one of the largest challenges I've ever had in my experience as a security person, is that when we have a meeting about getting these things remediated, we bring up a spreadsheet and we all argue about which version it is, and then we have an hour-long meeting and point at the wall and point at fingers at everybody else. And then we walk out, and the next month, Patch Tuesday, whatever, we go back in again and we have another argument about the spreadsheet and we figure out where we were from last week. If everyone has access to the information...
Usually the first half of the meeting is the argument about which version it is, right?
Exactly. It's literally, I've got
the first half is who can we blame?
Right. Yes, good point, right? We need more cigars and whiskey in those meetings, I think. Well, hopefully we don't have to have them, right? Because we could be all in the same application. We're all looking at the same live data. And then we can say, well, where are you with, in terms of patching? Well, I just got this vulnerability assigned to me. And in the old world, you'd say, well, that patch was available, 90 days ago. Well, it's my new problem as of a day ago. In our system, you can decide that patch, it always needs to be solved in 90 days, or it's solved in 90 days from the assignment point.
In the vulnerability realm, John, I'm just going to jump in here for a moment. What is the evaluation criteria for this solution? I think we kind of hit on something, having a vulnerability management background. I think the number one competitor to any solution that helps you manage your vulnerabilities and manage remediation is Microsoft Excel. So if you're using Microsoft, that could be one of the evaluation criteria. And so what does ServiceNow's security module provide above and beyond what people have become so comfortable with managing vulnerabilities and remediation through Excel?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, you don't need to dump the data out of Excel and then try to get the fields right and all things like that, right? The second component is we're tying it back to the assets that you have in your environment, those CIs that you have automatically. Next time they come in, based on a set of criteria, we pull them right and relate them to those particular systems. Thirdly, these systems have owners. These owners use ServiceNow today to run their change management cycle, right? If they want to make a change on a box, they know that's their system. And so you're not assigning that work, which, quite frankly, I call them a security quarterback, right? Every organization, any large organization has these security quarterbacks. They're super, super high intelligent people. They know where everybody is buried in your entire environment. And they have the most unrewarding job. They just give people work. Well, now you can put a system in place to do that. Notifications, SLAs, all those things are there, calculated over time, and then easy through their change process that they have, right? Templatize the less keystrokes, less backwards and forwards, immediately get it to the right person. The other very critical thing is most vulnerabilities in an infrastructure level, like the Qualys, the Rapid7, and Tenables of the world, they discover these things by IP. That's not necessarily how they're remediated. They're systems owners, the application owner on top of those IPs. That may be an Oracle DBA, right? They're the ones who are going to patch there. So the first time they get this spreadsheet, it's assigned to Mike, the IP owner, right? Not whoever the particular application owner is. And in this case, your route, that first time you get it, you fix it, it's set in stone going forward.
All right, so we got some questions here. Going to roll in. The first one that I have is from Ken. I got some small ones we'll come back to at the end. And some of these are some longer questions. And Ken even apologized, said sorry for being so wordy. He said, well, vulnerabilities do need to get remediated and teams need to see them. However, how can you control data that needs to stay in the system and not be sent as part of an insecure email alert or an Excel spreadsheet to let a person know what needs to be fixed? I can trust data is secure in the app, but can you control the data that's being sent in email or outside of the system? And I think that a lot of times, just kind of setting that up, just to kind of clarify, I think that a lot of systems that require people to use email or require people to use Excel and spread things around means that the system itself doesn't have a very good control capability for disseminating that information to who needs it. So I just wanted to kind of help clarify.
No, absolutely. Thank you for that. So I think one of the important things, this is a benefit that, again, ServiceNow has as a platform, right? We have, underneath that platform are things like ACLs, notification engines, different prioritization, right? So we can key off of any of that information to make a decision as to whether or not, or how we're going to disseminate it, right? For example, if it's a critical, we'll use 1 to 5 ratings, right? So a 5 rating is the worst rating. Maybe for 5 ratings, you don't want to send notifications that contain any of the data there. You just want to say, there's new work, right? And then maybe lower down the stack, a 3 or something like that, you decide that it's appropriate that everyone can have this via their email system. Now, most organizations are trusting their own email system because, unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, it's sort of how they do all their work. I get too much email. I'm sure everybody here does.
I hate email. I hate email in the context of this conversation because I feel like if we have a process in place in a tool such as ServiceNow, we shouldn't have to, Mike and I shouldn't have to email each other to figure out what patches need to be applied. That should be in the system already.
Absolutely. If we're having that conversation, ideally we're having that conversation about a nuance of a particular install.
Right.
And that's troubleshooting, right? That's not disseminating work.
Right. Yes. This is a good distinction.
So I hope that got another one. Okay, I think it's a very good question. This one's from Joel. He says, I'm having a hard time understanding how the solution is set up based on the website and the information therein. Is this an on-prem system? Is this software as a service, or can it be either? Also, if it identifies CIs, how does it actually make its inventory?
So a couple of questions there, right? So the first one, ServiceNow is a cloud company, right? We're a software as a service company. We have been since its inception. We never had an on-premise solution. And so it is a cloud offering. We are a multi-instance organization, which is a little bit different than other clouds. A lot of clouds are sort of a single-tenant solution. We used to say that we're a logically single-tenant solution. Now we've called it multi-instance, just a change in wording. But essentially, everyone's data is isolated within themselves. That's the first question there. The second question I forgot already.
The second question is, how do you actually load data into the system? Like, how does it identify the assets?
Of course. So ServiceNow has a discovery capability. So we have 2 discovery capabilities, actually. We have an on-wire-based discovery, so we can scan a CIDR, right? Quickly, /24, we'll scan that, we'll find some stuff. What we do is SNMP polling, the standard-based, we can do authenticated-based scanning there. Then the second one is something we call Service Watch, which is actually a top-down discovery. And in those cases, you've identified in your environment certain business services that if they go down, you have a bad day, right? So and maybe even one that you need to translate a little bit. So perhaps a system like, the user calls in and says, my email is down, right? Well, what does that mean? To the user, they don't care what that means. All they know is that they can't work. And so with something like a Service Watch, you can actually plug in the credential, let's say, at OWA, and it can walk down through the environment and it'll create a business service. So what are all of these things that we've discovered on the wire? What are those things together actually serve back to the environment? And that helps you with security because it gives you an insight into what are the systems that I care about. If my SAP financial system goes down a week before the end of the quarter, that's probably something I'm going to answer very quickly.
Really
versus,
bad.
Versus some switch that we have in an isolated environment where it's not really, serving us on a day-to-day basis. It's a thing we can get to.
And that kind of answered another question that we had from Bill. He asked, for ServiceNow to work effectively, the shop has to have a maturity level where CMDB has been compiled and CIs have been defined, or can you start with the minimum or no CMDB? And I think that you answered that as far as finding the assets and breaking those assets down. They don't need to have an existing CMDB. It's something that you can assist create, correct?
Absolutely. We can also supplement that data. So, for example, I mentioned some of the vulnerability scanners. Tenable specifically, we just recently announced a strategic partnership with, which we're super excited about. But we can import that information, that scan data that they've had, and actually populate and supplement some of that data, because IT people have a very different view about things, right? When IT people worry about a system in an environment, they care about what it does for a living, right? On the security side, We want to know what potentially it can do to make me have a bad day. And so there's different angles to look at these things. So if I take data in from a vulnerability system, I know all of its capabilities. When I look at something from an IT perspective, I know what it is supposed to be doing. And what it should be doing for a security person is kind of a great thing too. Like, I know it has to be talking to that box. If it's not talking to that box, I'm also going to have a problem.
Yeah.
Are there other integrations that you feel, Mike, are pretty strong, or like, are there points of confusion about, hey, like, what does ServiceNow integrate with? What should I integrate it with? What questions should I be asking about integrations?
Yeah, thank you.
And by the way, that for the record is the next question. Actually, Paul's reading my mind, from Simon, talking about orchestration and integration with other EDR products such as firewalls and other things. So
yeah,
Paul's
absolutely.
just on it.
No, he is. So, SIM is one of those capabilities where you'd expect to have an integration with us, especially on the incident response side, right? If you have a SIM alert, you want to know how to respond to that SIM alert, or you have a method that you respond to that SIM alert, or at least you want to catalog that someone needs to do something about this alert, right? So it needs to be stateful, and then it ideally should tie back to a process we have in the environment. And maybe you have one or two. And when we started in ServiceNow in our own ops world, when we started with an incident response application, we only had a single IR policy. It was a policy and a procedure. It was huge, and no one could read it, and we never knew what the right version was. As soon as we put it into a system, we digitized that playbook, we all of a sudden started to split and split and split. Now all of a sudden we were being walked down this path, right? So when it comes to integrations, we could say, a SIM solution that comes in and alerts us about, the SOC about something. Maybe it's malware. And now I plug in and I know I'm going to follow the malware procedure, right? The malware procedure may have some things that I would run, perhaps a toolbox of things, or a set of scripts, right? A bag full of scripts I'd run against the box. Well, maybe we can do that programmatically in the back end, right? Some passive-based automation. Perhaps I can go and run the same 5 commands I run against every box that pops up for malware through ServiceNow and have the data right in front of me, so I can get to my decision point faster, as opposed to running those scripts every time using my credentials. You see how that sort of windfalls into a larger challenge. EDR solutions, absolutely, right? There's an agent on that box. Let's get in and connect to that agent. So a Carbon Black or a Tanium, we can plug into that particular agent and use those agents for what they're designed to do.
It sounds like...
And you were talking about... Oh, sorry, Paul.
Go ahead.
I've got a question for you, by the way. As far as SIMs, just a quick question. I assume that the answer is yes. She wanted to know, do you guys integrate with Splunk?
We do. We have multiple integrations with Splunk. They've been a partner of ours for a long time.
Cool. And Paul, Anthony wants to know, what brand of cigar are you smoking today?
EP Carrillo, New Wave Reserva, Corona size, actually.
Good. Sorry. Go ahead, Paul.
No, it sounds like ServiceNow has been doing even aspects, maybe much of security orchestration and automation for some time. Like, it sounds like that was always like what you had in mind in the systems you were building. Now it's this new category in security, and it's funny we mentioned Splunk because they just bought Phantom Cyber, right? Yep, but it sounds like I always thought of ServiceNow as kind of like, oh yeah, we can do security orchestration and automation now too, but it sounds like you've been doing that all along, dude. We
absolutely have. It's been an area of interest for us for a long time. Where discovery is the first natural discovery in some ways is some sort of automation, right? You're scanning a bunch of boxes, right? So that was like step 1. And then step 2 was do something about it, right? So perhaps I want to disable an account on a system. In the IT world, that's not terribly uncommon, right? They do the offboarding in most cases. And so those sorts of things were areas that we've been doing this for, probably get yelled at for not having the exact number, but I would say probably 4 years plus that we've been doing this. And we've been quite frankly, excited about this opportunity for a while. And I myself, internally, because I sort of try to get this thing forward and get this thing built within ServiceNow for a long time because we built it for our own uses. I've been touting this for a while now, and the recent acquisition, further validation that this is an absolute market that's going to grow, and we know that people need to do more with the individuals they have, and we need to give the analysts a better day, not becoming. Remember the MOUSE acronym that we used to have? It used to be the Microsoft Office User Systems Engineer or whatever it was.
Yes, I can see
this may
that.
be taken back a few years, right?
No,
so not being a mouse expert, right? Not being an expert in Excel anymore, but being an expert in being able to respond to these things faster and easier.
So, we were talking about it before we actually kicked off the webcast in earnest about pricing. And that's a really, really difficult question to quantify in a webcast very quickly. However, there have been a couple of questions that came up that are basically in the area of small to mid-sized organizations. how exactly, not exactly, but in general, broad strokes, how does the pricing model support small to mid-sized organizations to get the modules and the control that they want without necessarily having to pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that large organizations can afford?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
and I'll just add on to that, like, how is it packaged? So not so much pricing, because like but like, how do you buy it? Like, how is it packaged? Yeah.
So one of the most important things when it comes to pricing for us, and when we thought through pricing, we wanted to make sure that it was, you could use it, right? You weren't deciding whether or not you were going to use it based on the price that you paid for the solution. So everyone in the environment, everyone in your organization is going to help you remediate an incident. If you don't have too many of them, maybe less of those people are going to be involved. But you don't want to worry about whether or not your legal team is licensed in this system, your PR and your marketing team. You don't want to worry if they're licensed in the system. And so we looked at it and we went, let's build a pricing around a module and then about how big you are, right? About how big is the problem that you have. And so that's specifically how it's priced. So there's modules, the components I've mentioned, the security incident response, vulnerability response, and threat intelligence. And then there are the how big is your environment, right? How much pain do you have on a day-to-day basis?
And how do you, what are some of the qualifications into the size of the, is it people, is it events, is it storage? Like, how do you qualify that?
Yeah, good question. So it's things that can be compromised in your environment. So what can be compromised in your environment?
So not just systems, but applications as well. Your assets, right?
More around the devices, right? So IP-based devices. So very similarly to how a lot of the vulnerability solutions are priced.
Cool.
I've been involved in a lot of those packaging and pricing conversations too, and it's not easy. I'll tell you that much. It's not easy.
No,
at all.
And you know, specifically to the small and medium business size, you know, we sort of looked at all of our customers, ServiceNow customers, and ServiceNow sells generally to large enterprise organizations. But to the, you know, sort of that small enterprise organization, I was shocked at how many of these organizations came over. Even state and local government were jumping on this solution. We've got a couple of really great cities that will be at our knowledge conference that are going to be presenting, which we're very excited about.
Yeah. So like, when do I know if I need ServiceNow based on the size of my organization? Like, if I've got 10 workstations, probably
a little bit overkill.
Probably a little bit overkill. Like, so like, at what size should you start looking at ServiceNow?
Well, I think a great way to compare it is, what technologies do I have today? And so if I have a SIM, or I'm looking to purchase a SIM and bring one in, it's a great time to look at ServiceNow. If you have a vulnerability scanning system and you have it in place and you know about those vulnerabilities, great opportunity to bring in something like ServiceNow.
That answered my question of how tall you're going to be to ride the ride.
Yeah, that's it.
I like phrasing it that way. I don't know. Sometimes we say, like, when am I ready?
Yep.
But like, how tall do I need to be? Yeah,
perfect.
Two good qualifiers right there. Like, more than 10 computers. You've got or considering purchasing a SIM, and you've either got or considering a vulnerability management solution, likely one from the bigger three. Like, you're big enough to have a vulnerability management, not just one person running an individual scanner, right? Like a management system.
Absolutely.
Make the differentiation there, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, we do integrate with other than just those three that I've mentioned, but, you know, those are the three ones that they just, you know, they're all day long, you hear them.
Awesome.
So we have two people. We have Emmanuel and Hans that asked about integration with data loss prevention products.
So we are actively working with data loss prevention technologies. One is Symantec, because we've got some experience there. But really, it's how do you engage, right? So is it a follow-up? Is it a back and forward? So ServiceNow being a platform, hate to keep saying that word over and over again, but literally it is. Sorry,
that was really strange noise.
So when you have a DLP event fire up, what is it? Why did it fire up? Right? Am I looking for an exclusion for that DLP event? Am I just looking to run down to this individual's desk or send someone down to the individual's desk, as we talked about, to go follow up? Like, what does that look like? These are all capabilities within ServiceNow. Just integrating with them is very straightforward, and then expanding on the use case, right?
Now this one's interesting. Roscoe is a current customer. He said, currently you're using GRC to house the vulnerabilities and remediation tasks. There seems to be a little bit of overlap between GRC and what the security operations module provides. Where should they be performing these vulnerability identifications, remediation, and tracking?
So we actually built, so the GRC capability and the vulnerability response application are very, very tightly linked. They obviously we're run by the same organization. We're all part of the security business that we have at ServiceNow. So there is actually a lot of complementary things between those two. And I could see where maybe it would appear that there's some ambiguity there. The reality is, when you have a vulnerability at a vulnerability, so a one-to-one, right? Like iced tea bottle has got a hole in it, right? That's the vulnerability that I have on this particular thing. When I have this vulnerability, I may need to, for some reason, excuse this vulnerability from the SLA.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that I would do within vulnerability response. So I would defer the patching of that system for, we'll just say 30 days, right? Because it's not super critical, I'm going to be able to put it off for 30 days. Now, in GRC, I want to know that I've exercised that particular right. And I want to know if this is a systemic problem within my organization.
And know why.
And know why. And
right? Because the auditor is going to ask why.
Absolutely. And who signed off on that, right? Was it Mike? Or was it Mike and Mike's boss, Paul? They both said, you know what? Mike's right. This thing's a leak, but it's not the end of the world. We can wipe up the mess later, right? So being able to do that is an important thing. Having that data accessible for those in those GRC modules against a control that I have in place is where those things would interoperate. In terms of just tracking the vulnerabilities, that's very much in the vulnerability response side of the house. Now, reporting on, I mentioned a business service earlier, figuring out whether or not I have a business service that's just always lagging behind in terms of patching, that's critical stuff. Like, why is it falling behind? Is it falling behind because I have some old technology there and I need to look at, maybe updating that technology? Or perhaps it's XSS and it's constantly happening on the custom app and we've got some training issues we have to work through.
Or that one team is just lagging behind on patches versus the rest of the organization.
Absolutely.
Because that happens too.
Absolutely. And having that SLA dashboard where I can see.
And I hate to say shaming them into applying patches is a way to go, but sometimes it's effective.
I think gamification is the new word for shaming.
There you go.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Phil. He said, earlier you mentioned assigning tasks out. Are there integrations for teams that don't feel ticketing systems are agile enough? For example, DevOps teams that won't talk to you outside of HipChat or Jira or Slack or those things.
Yes, absolutely. So, I'll say it. We use Slack internally in ServiceNow. We have an enterprise-wide deployment in ServiceNow, and we actually have integrations even within the security teams. People don't necessarily love ticketing systems. Now, we don't like to think we're a ticketing system because I don't think we are. But at the end of the day, maybe where I'm running, we were talking earlier about going backwards and forwards on trying to deal with an issue. I might use Slack. So one capability we can do is we can create a channel that's isolated within Slack and run that issue to ground, inviting only those members that have permission to that particular channel, cataloging and auditing all of that, so keeping a record of it in ServiceNow. And then when it's closed off, the channel's closed off, the entire chat ends up in ServiceNow. So that's been tracked through. We also have a capability called Connect, which allows you to do a similar chat-like conversation, but within ServiceNow, right within a browser or on your watch or on your phone.
I had a question and somewhat of a comment too, I guess, to lead into a question based on experience that we had here at Security Weekly that I drew upon my past to go, wow, I've been in this situation numerous times. And that is a patch comes out for any particular system. Maybe it's the hole in your iced tea bottle, right? Inevitably, sometimes I feel like patches were designed sheerly just to break things. And I was reminded how much stuff breaks when we apply that patch, right? And when it does blow up, like there needs to be some kind of plan of remediation. Mm-hmm. And what I remembered was in various organizations I worked for, I was like, oh yeah, before we made any kind of change, like a patch, there was a maintenance window. And there was a process to say, I am Paul, I'm a network security engineer. I would like to make a change to the BGP routing configuration on the internet router. True story. And here is the change I would like to make. Here is why I would like to make that change. Here is my back out plan for that change. I would submit that. Someone would sign off. It would happen during a maintenance window. Mm-hmm. Everyone would get that notification, including the help desk, because people are going to call up and go, why is the internet down? Well, Paul's being an idiot, and I messed up the BGP table. I backed out my change.
You didn't take YouTube out, though, so that's good.
What's that?
You didn't take YouTube out.
I didn't take YouTube out. No, just our own internet access, right? And like coming out of that, like we had a lessons learned with the whole team, and it was like no harm, no foul. Everyone learned from that because we realized that when we make a change, it's going to break something and that there needs to be a process around that. I'm assuming that ServiceNow helps and to facilitate that process because it's so critical to applying patches.
So glass half full, not every patch breaks something.
Well, most. I feel like every patch does lately. I don't know, it's just the streak that we're on, but
yeah. Bad week.
So Spectre Meltdown, Spectre.
Yes. Slightly more complicated, yes.
Right.
So, Absolutely, right. One of the major things that we have is templatized changes, right? So when you have a change that goes in place, and imagine the association here. So you have a template. Sure, that's the general patch template, right? So it's got some things you have to plug it and play with. The second one is maybe it's a patch, maybe it's a template for a particular server, like maybe a Windows server. Then separately on that, maybe it's something like Windows Exchange, and I can actually build these templates up front, make sure that the person who's patching this system understands what steps they need to follow, right? So those procedures are right there. They're going to acknowledge, I have in fact finished these 5 bullet points along the way. Right. And you can make those in, the easiest way is to say, I can list them out in a text box, and then they acknowledge that they've done those things. But maybe you have certain things where you want to be a little bit more hand-holdy. You could have a task that's generated underneath that and say, well, before you can move to phase 2 of the change, you need to complete this task. And then once they've completed that task, the next task, and walk them through that whole process. And then over time, move it up and be able to actually move it down the stack, right? Allow someone who's not necessarily the top level Exchange expert, maybe not require them to do it, but allow someone who's maybe a little bit more junior to do it, because you've really ironed out all of the creases. Take that same process, apply it to IR. It's exactly the same thing. Right. So today, most things go right to tier 3, right? What happens when tier 1 can start doing stuff, right? How rewarding is that for tier 1? And how rewarding is that for tier 3, who doesn't have to say, oh, I'll show you how to do this again, right?
That's awesome.
So we've had a number of people ask about the pricing for small to medium-sized businesses. And I just want to kind of reiterate, this isn't in this webcast, it's not something where we can give out pricing and say, for your organization, it's going to be $2. It doesn't work that way, folks. So if you are interested, please contact the ServiceNow sales representatives and get the adequate kind of right pricing. And also, I would also encourage, the more information you give the sales reps, the better they're going to be able to price out the product for you. Don't try to hold things back. Now, we have a couple of questions that I would like to bring up. One of them, just kind of getting into some hard questions, right? We've talked a lot about the strengths to the solution. What are the limitations of the solution as well?
So I think the biggest limitation is there's a new vendor every week that's coming out with an interesting security capability. And trying to get them integrated with us, we only have so many engineers that we can apply to this. And then there's only so much training we can have to get these folks to be able to build their own applications within integrations within ServiceNow. So I think the major one is trying to get more integrations. That's something that we've got a number of them. I'd say 100 integrations, or close to 100 integrations today. We're working on making more and more and getting them out there faster. But that's going to be our major challenge. That's going to be a challenge for us.
The other one that was an interesting question. Anytime you try to bring a product like ServiceNow into an organization, kind of cutting right to the chase, regardless of what the pricing model actually is for small, medium, and large, you always have to justify it to upper management. So how do you actually recognize and sell across the idea of return on investment for something like ServiceNow?
So I think the first measurement is going to be, I have a SOP that I follow for remediating some sort of security incident, right? So just containing that thread and containing that particular item that I'm working with, and also then eradicating it from my environment. So the first one is you turn it on day one and you figure out how long, right? We have metrics that are calculated across the board for every little stage. And these are not things you need to go configure. These are not things that you need to understand how to change. These are there. That's like out of the box. And so when you're looking at this, how long does it take me to remediate this particular issue? Well, down the line using ServiceNow for a month, now how long does it take me to really remediate these particular things? Am I doing better over time, right? Answering that, like, I used to use like the stoplight analogy, and I actually spoke with the CISO, financial services CISO customer of ours, and on the wall he had sort of these trend lines of how each security team was doing. And it was just based on the amount of work they had in ServiceNow that they were running. And when the line was going like this, different than yesterday, different than the day before, he knew whether or not he was going to have a good day, right? So now being able to say...
He sent booze to that department, right?
Yes, exactly. Well, it's cases of Busch Light.
Yeah.
Coors. It's Coors. I'm sure.
I do want to just take a short break, because I forgot to mention this in the beginning of the webcast. We did a contest for this webcast, which we haven't done in some time, and I brought it back. And this contest was, we picked a winner at random to win an NVIDIA Shield. Larry, Pesce, and myself are going to be doing some segments on Paul Security Weekly about cutting the cord and some of the innovative things we've done for the entertainment systems in our home. So we thought it'd be nice to give away an NVIDIA Shield and thank everyone for well, one lucky person who'll win it for attending the webcast, and just thank our listeners for being involved. So we'll do more of this as it comes up. So Zach F is the winner of the NVIDIA Shield for today's webcast. So Zach, if you're listening, you can send email to psw@securityweekly.com to claim your prize. Also, Sam will probably also reach out to you individually as well. We just need your address, and we're going to drop ship you an NVIDIA Shield.
So Zach, how exactly does it feel to be hated by over 200 people all at the same time?
He's going to need a real shield.
I don't know if Zach's in the actually. This is based on people who register. He is. Okay, he is. Okay. Mm-hmm. Congratulations, Zach. All right. Sorry. Continue.
All right. On with the questions. This is more of a general question, but I think it's a really, really, really good question. So the idea of security operations, just SecOps, is really new to a lot of people, right? Regardless of whether or not they're using something like ServiceNow or anything like that. Where do you recommend that people try to get information associated with security operations just to know the concepts to sell management on those ideas?
So I think the first starting point is to read the Gartner SOAR report if you have access to it. If you don't have access to it, Google around. There's a lot of links to it. We have one on our website, which you can easily download on ServiceNow.com. That's one good starting point. I think, quite frankly, I've been long-time listener, first-time caller kind of thing here with Pulse Security Weekly. I've gained a lot out of listening to podcasts like these. There are other podcasts that I think have high value, and you know, I've got a lot out of the SANS training. We actually have some SANS trainers that are employed by ServiceNow. They're part of our team that help build these solutions. I think those are highly valuable, and obviously, if you need a sleep aid, but are looking for good content, NIST, a lot of the NIST reports, the NIST documents are very valuable. NIST 861. It's worth reading. ISO 27035. It's worth looking at. Those are definitely strong starting points.
Cool. We got another question. How does ServiceNow help, or how does the ServiceNow security module help InfoSec compliance as a whole?
We haven't talked about compliance yet, really.
No, not too much. Just to touch on it earlier with the vulnerability side. Well, I think, first and foremost, tying into GDPR, right? GDPR is for any international organization, anyone who's operating in Europe. It's a looming threat that's going to happen pretty soon. But you have this 72-hour response requirement in privacy, right? So figuring out what your procedure is, ironing that one out quickly, I think that's probably the biggest one. And privacy, GDPR is the first one. It's not really the first one. It's the first one that has a pretty big stick behind it.
And I think it's more even overarching than you alluded to. If you're a US-based company and you're storing information and data about people who are residents in the EU, then you got to be paying attention to GDPR. And I really think that if you haven't been paying attention, like all of a sudden one day you're going to be like, uh-oh.
It's going to hurt a lot.
It's going to hurt because there are, larger firms that store lots of data, like payroll companies, for example. They were like, oh, yeah, we need to pay attention to this really early on. I've been working for a long time towards compliance. I think there's other companies that are going to kind of get bit by this.
Absolutely. And, they're going to target most likely non-EU based companies first. It's, it would, who knows what they're going to target, but there's an opportunity there for them to really make, to say that this is how we're going to improve, the security
They're going to make an example out of someone.
That's the word I didn't want to say.
So sorry. So how does ServiceNow's can help with that problem?
So first and foremost, by having a procedure in place, ironing out the kinks in those procedures, right? Running tabletop exercises through your system, that's 100% going to help with your compliance there. You know you're going to be compliant there. When you're categorizing each one of these issues as they come in, as a privacy-related issue, right? Or maybe the CI in the CMDB has been flagged as having PII on it, right? Or EPHI or some other data, PCI data, whatever the data is. Ensuring that when you have one of these issues on this box, right, there's a series of things that you need to make sure that you handle, right? Am I HIPAA certified when I'm going to go touch a box that's filled with HIPAA data? I might need to consider that, right? And so when you have these things, ServiceNow is going to help you understand and how to run these processes to ground by flagging the key pieces of information related to this.
Along those lines, one, and this is what I've gleaned so far from our conversation, is that I tell enterprises when they're considering any security solution that some of the foundational elements you need to have are, you need to know what you have in terms of assets, right? Your hosts, your applications, all of those things. You need to know, well, you need to classify what your data is, like levels of sensitivity, right? And even if that's low, medium, high, right? And then...
Or just high.
Or just high.
Understand what your
high is, right? But then know like where that data lives in your environment, and then know who owns that data.
Yeah.
Sounds like ServiceNow is a platform. I mean, it's not going to solve all those problems. Like, I'm not going to go buy ServiceNow. It's like, yeah, I just covered everything that Paul said.
I don't have a switch in the back. Yeah. I'd love one, but I don't have it. Sorry.
It's a huge help with that whole process, right?
Absolutely. You need to know where you're going to start from. And quite frankly, if I gave you that switch, most of us wouldn't have a job. That's not what we need, right? We have these people, the automation that we're putting in place is to make these things happen more smoothly and understand them, and then
do it for you.
No, and then get the smart people that are employed by you to do other smart things within your environment,
right?
And get them out of the order taking, the notification stuff. Give them the ability to do what they really wanted to join and do.
But going back to our conversation on like when are you ready, you could do this before in the planning stage of things we identified of SIM and vulnerability management and other things. You can almost say, well, we're going to develop that plan, have a tabletop around, okay, how do we collect all of our assets and collect all that data and know who the system owners are, know who our applications are. Okay, then we're going to implement ServiceNow. We're going to plug it all into that system and get that going. Then we're going to add SIM and vulnerability management and the security things around it and incident response. Because if you don't know where all your stuff is and who needs to access it and who owns what data and where your data is, how do you apply any security to your organization in the first place?
Absolutely. And another component of that is when I buy a technology, when I buy a security technology, one of the things that I've definitely done this. I bought a technology, I turned on all the things, tell me about all the things, right? Well, all the things when I started in security were a digestible amount for me. All the things in the world right now are not a digestible amount.
Yeah.
The security vendors that are out there have produced some really good technologies to find so many things. It's way too much for me to consume. So now I've got to figure out, am I getting the value out of that, right? So you mentioned DLP earlier, John, or one of the listeners mentioned DLP earlier. Well, when I put DLP in place, if I just looked for all addresses, I'd have way more stuff that I can deal with, right? So how can I tune these rules in a SIM? How can I tune these rules in a DLP capability to ensure that I'm getting the value out of the tool? And when I have this alert, I know what to do next. Not just sending me an alert, but if I get an alert from a SIM, do I have to run 5 more queries to actually figure out how I'm going to respond to this? Well, maybe that's not a great alert.
Yeah.
In IT, they've been doing this for a while. And in security, I think we're coming around to it.
So that kind of leads into 2 additional questions that we have. One of them says, this product sounds like it's complicated. How mature does my program need to be to actually effectively use this technology?
So that's a question I think I answer a few times a week.
Yeah.
I honestly, when we started this in my world, when we started this at ServiceNow, we weren't as mature as we would have liked to have been. And so we started down this path. And we realized one of the things we could do was take the most common use case and focus on ironing out that procedure, right? So the first one I would say is for a moderately mature shop, right? You understand security, but overall your procedures are not great. Start with something that happens all day long, right? Start with something like people reporting in phishing.
I was going to say email phishing is usually a pretty good place to start, right?
It's
because it happens a lot. It's compartmentalized.
It comes to you.
Yeah, exactly.
It comes to you, right? There is work that you have to do with every one of them if you're doing your job right. So even if they're sending them to security@acme.com, that's okay. But do you send that user an acknowledgement and say, thanks for sending that over to security.com?
Right.
Or at acme.com, right? Well, what if I just sent it over to us, right? Keep that security@acme.com because you've paid for your security awareness training and that's how you told your users to deal with it. Don't change the process for them. But now when you ingest it, do some work, right? Tell the user, thank you for reporting. A second stage is let's look in this message, right? Is there an attachment? Let me shoot it over to Cuckoo. Let me shoot it over to Wildfire or something like that. Explode it. Let me look at all of the potential things that can hurt me, right? Let me look, are there any indicators in here? Do I have these indicators in my threat database? Do I want to integrate with VirusTotal and do a lookup there, right? All this stuff is automation that won't get you fired. Probably.
Most of the time?
Most of the time. All the stuff is automation that won't get you fired. It's passive automation, so it's sort of the term that I use, right?
Yeah.
And then go from there, right? So maybe the next step is, well, the Exchange admin and I went and had a cigar together, and now he's going to let me have an integration into him to find out if anybody else has got this message, right? So now you know it's bad. So now I can do something. I can start at my action side. I can delete it from the user. I can tell the user, hey, great job. I actually know of an organization that is actively like giving their users who report the most suspicious emails and are accurate, like water bottles and T-shirts. Like,
gift cards.
And, you know, you get this send
right.
as part of your security, you know, the month letter or whatever. You literally can say, hey, you know, John's awesome. He reported the most bad messages, right?
Yeah, it just so recently I've been along those lines. I've been playing around with the Security Onion, John. The most recent version, which actually has an elk stack built into it, which I was like, wow, that's like a new thing. It's experimental, and I've been playing around with it. And I tell you what, if you're looking for like a place to start, go set up the Security Onion, and it's a pretty easy process to do. Get a spam port, set up Security Onion, and just start looking at those alerts. And man, I tell you, you're going to start noticing trends, and then you're going to say, well, how do I automate that stuff? And that's going to help right there. So
absolutely, maybe another area after phishing, because a lot of people talk about phishing, is just malware, right? The malware alerts you get. That's the next stage, right? So I mentioned earlier those bag of scripts, right? Let's not have 5 people running 5 different versions of these scripts. Let's have one system that everybody's recognized. These are the scripts we want to run. This gets the information. What processes are running on the box? What ports are those processes mapping back to? What IP addresses are those ports connected to?
So I got another question I wanted to distill down because it's a long one. But I think it boils down to one simple question. What are the major mistakes that you see new customers make when trying to implement ServiceNow that you have to go through and correct them again and again on?
I think people just try to boil the ocean. They try to change too much process and too much technology at the same time. Put in a technology, start with the process, and grow from there. The opportunity to grow is going to increase rapidly as you understand how you get more comfortable with change. When you start out and you try to change everything at once, it's like walking into a new house. When I came into the studio, the guy said they rearranged the room, and I asked somebody where I could throw my gum away, and they were like, where the hell's the garbage can? And it was like, oh, we just rearranged the room yesterday, right? So imagine that in a whole organization. It's a very complicated scenario. So start with something that you know you can change, and then grow from there. And you'll be able to change faster. You'll learn quickly how fast you can change.
And then we get some hard questions that Paul and I like to close these things out with. One of them that we like to ask every single vendor that comes on is, what are the other major players in this space? And what do you think you have that makes your solution better?
Email and Microsoft Excel is probably your number one competitor,
I think
right?
you actually nailed that.
Absolutely the biggest competitors out there, right?
Yes.
When we first started this, we say, well, we really don't have any competition. Everyone hates to hear that. I hate to say it, but the reality is that's our competitor, right? Our biggest competitors are email and Excel. I think the other side of it is IBM made an acquisition. Splunk's made an acquisition.
Sure.
IBM bought Resilient Technologies. We see those from time to time, mostly in this.
Resilient's trying to get in on the automation and orchestration side. Traditionally, they're an incident response management company, right?
Yeah, I haven't seen a whole lot of them in that side of the house.
Sure.
They probably have a year or two, maybe out a year or two before us. We saw some in some locations, and then Phantom on the SOAR side we saw, and obviously that was an acquisition by
Phantom, Demisto, to a certain extent D3. There's another one in there. DF Labs is another. And they stem from very different areas, right? Obviously, ServiceNow came from IT management, getting a handle on your environment, which I think is really cool. Some of the other players in the space started out in forensics, case management, went to incident management, and now we're trying to also glom on the automation orchestration, which I think that's really a valid path, for them, and they have some value to add there as well. But it's very, very interesting how all of your other great things you do aside, if we just look at the SOAR, automation and orchestration side, how that market is evolving.
Well, I think the last part of SOAR is the thing where we excel massively.
Well, yeah, because you have all the data about everything in your environment.
Absolutely.
Who owns the data, what the assets are, what the SLAs are, the change management, and all that stuff. So that's a very powerful place to come from. Rapid7 also made an acquisition as well. So, there are large companies that are buying other companies to gain that. ServiceNow is a large company. I would put you in the category of large company that developed
Weird to hear that now, but yeah.
But you didn't do this through acquisition, is my point. You didn't go buy a company to do automation and orchestration. You built that from the ground up and integrated it with your environment, which to me is a good thing to notice if you're shopping in this space, that's how that came about to be. And then there are smaller, I would say smaller players that grew from different areas that are trying to compete in the space that haven't yet been acquired, like Command and Phantom both got acquired.
Yes.
So
I think the other big benefit that we have, ServiceNow has, is being a platform company, we can inherit a lot of really cool stuff, right? So we can inherit things like our performance analytics, right? So how long does it take you to move the case along the line, right? Taking all those metrics and doing massive trending. We don't write any of that code in our BU. We consume that from another BU within our organization, right? Authentication, platform security, the continuous testing of our product, which is a SaaS company, right? So we have to test the security team, and I know those guys well because they were teammates for a long time. They still are, but teammates for a long time, right? Those guys are constantly testing our technology and ensuring that it's a secure solution, right? And we have the benefit of consuming all of that as a service.
Well, look, in terms of integrations, I wanted to ask you too, when you talk about identity and access management or privileged identity management, you mentioned before that you may have to go disable someone's account, right? You do that through an integration. That's not something you have. You would integrate with a CyberArk or CA or whatever, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Now, specifically, we could write an integration to integrate with AD and disable an account if you'd like to.
Sure.
If you'd like to do that, that's absolute capability. But also, CyberArk integration, absolutely. That makes
CyberArk's
it makes
one of your listed partners that you
have.
Okay.
Yes.
Fantastic.
And that is it for the questions. Any final comments?
Well, I really appreciate this today. If you have the opportunity, all the listeners out there, please go to servicenow.com/secops and have a read of the Gartner SOAR report. It's a really high value report. And
I'd also say a very interesting category in security to underscore that point, because I've been following it pretty closely for probably just shy of a year now. And to see it just make some of these transitions has been really, just from an analyst, like business analyst kind of position, I think it's really interesting. It's also interesting from a technology perspective as well, especially, like I said, when you get into something like Security Onion, you're like, wow, how do I deal with all of that, right? And so I think that's really cool. Yeah. And this was a lot of fun.
Absolutely. So. This was great. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks so much, John. And all of our listeners and viewers today, thank you so much, and especially thank you to all of those of you that asked questions today. I thought your questions were spot on. Keep that up, and thank you all so much. And congratulations to Zach for winning the NVIDIA Shield. You can, of course, find our on-demand webcast at securityweekly.com/on-demand. If this webcast just wasn't enough and you want more, you can go there and get more. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching today. We'll see you next time.